In 1889, Copper King W.A. Clark and 74 other men wrote a state constitution to serve the needs of Montana's powerful interests, with a weak governor, a secretive legislature, and special tax deals for the powerful. After 60 years under the copper collar, Montana was declared the nearest thing to a colony of any American state. The Anaconda Mining Company even owned most Montana newspapers, the Copper Press. The corporate dominance of Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. 70 years after statehood, the Copper Press was finally sold, and thousands of World War II veterans had been educated under the GI Bill. Newly enlightened Montanans wanted out from under the copper collar, and big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Changing Montana's constitution was the top priority. Strengthening the governorship, opening up the legislature, empowering citizens. Voices of Montana women, totally silenced in 1889, rang out loud and clear for these changes. When the Constitutional Convention began, 19 women were among the elected delegates. And when the delegates came together in convention, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, men and women, young and old, sat alphabetically as equals, Montanans just wanting to make their state better. And so they did, producing a constitution for the ages, the last best constitution. Now at its 50th anniversary, Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time shine a light on the creation of this remarkable Montana Constitution.
Welcome back to Last Best Constitution. Our series is built around the development of the Montana Constitution in 1972. We're trying through this series to capture that momentous time in Montana history when there was such a convergence of forces that led to massive change in Montana. And one of the biggest evidences of that change was in the Constitution that was adopted by the people of Montana. Montana had been in existence for 75 years, actually 83 years by then, but about 75 years in, people started chafing quite a bit under the copper collar. Montana's government, Montana's economy, Montana's sociology, Montana's culture, all seemed to be built around the strong presence of the Anaconda Company and its allies. And the old Constitution that was adopted in 1889 was full of provisions that empowered the powerful. And people started looking at it a little bit differently after World War II, and after so many Montanans participated in the GI Bill and became educated, they started looking at Montana differently, and they saw change needed to be made. And so there were a number of ways in which that was evidenced, but none was more dramatic than the creation of a new constitution. Again, that's the focus of our series, and we've tried to gather the participants that are still around here and get the first-hand account of what happened throughout the development of the Montana's Constitution in 1972. So today, we are privileged to have Diana Dowling with us. Diana is, admittedly, I got to say, is a friend of mine since 1969. Now, that's a long time ago, and but we're still friends. And she's had an amazing career. Part of which was being involved in some important aspects of the Constitutional Convention. Welcome aboard.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. You know, why don't we, to kind of humanize this, tell us a bit about yourself and how you got from Graybill, Wyoming, which is where you came from,
okay,
to Helena, Montana, and then eventually into the Constitutional Convention. Tell us a little bit about that.
You told
path.
me you were going to tell all that.
Well, you can help us a little.
I'll just tell the beginning of how
Sure.
I got to Helena. Born in Graybill, Wyoming. oldest of 9 kids. We're all still living. My dad was the oldest of 14. My mom was the youngest of 7. I was a very good student. I loved school all along. I worked through high school. I became the best waitress in Wyoming, and I still hold that title. And then I had a scholarship to Carroll College.
How did that happen? I mean, did you just happen to look at Carroll, or what?
Carroll, at that time I was Roman Catholic, and Carroll College is a Catholic college, and it gave scholarships to the highest ranking graduate in all of Wyoming schools.
Oh, wow.
And I was the only Catholic graduate in my class. But I was also a good student, so I got a scholarship to Carroll, right? Mm-hmm. I had enrolled at the University of Wyoming.
Oh, all the way down there.
All the way down there.
To Laramie.
And I visited down there, and all the girls were wearing Jansen sweaters, and I couldn't afford stuff like that, so it was good I went to Carroll.
Oh, well, that's cool. That's cool. So once you got up here and were going to school, you met a certain someone who you've stayed connected with since all this time since then.
I met Tom Dowling my second day in town, and we went out on 2 dates, and that was it.
Now, you are an attorney.
Yes.
In fact, you are a very recognized, esteemed attorney. You have a great record of accomplishment as an attorney. But your path into becoming an attorney was not the usual path. Would you describe how you became an attorney and some of the travails of that?
Okay. Well, Tom, when he graduated from Carroll, the proposal was sort of like, let's get married and you could put me through law school. And so that's what women did in those days. Right. And it was called the PhD degree, putting hubby through. And so we were married. Tom went to law school 3 years, and I worked at different jobs in Missoula, and had a baby every year. Had a baby in 59, 60, 61, and then 63 and 65. But so when he got out of law school, and
now when he got out of law school, the graduates of the law school, unlike today, used to have a thing called diploma privilege. Right. Well, once they graduated, they were automatically able to enter the bar. They didn't have to take the bar exam.
Right.
In today's world, they have to take the bar exam. So he became an attorney, and I mentioned that bar exam because it's relevant to you.
Okay.
So he became an attorney.
And he got a job in Seattle.
Seattle.
With the SEC, Securities Exchange Commission.
Right.
And that's when my husband, Tom, found out that with the Montana Supreme Court, a person could register as a law student by correspondence.
Correspondence course, yeah.
And he suggested that I enroll in the LaSalle correspondence course because he knew I liked school, I liked college, I liked to study, and so I did. I enrolled in the LaSalle course, and
so that's when you were in Seattle with 4 children at that point?
Well, we had 4 children, right? And then we moved back to Helen.
Decided you take on going to law school by correspondence course when you had at home?
Well, when the kids were napping and stuff.
Sure, okay.
You know? Or even waiting in line at the store. I always had a law book with me. Anyway. Yeah, so then we moved back to Helena. Tom worked for the State Highway Department and different jobs. And I continued to study and took the bar exam correspondence students had to take the bar exam. At that time, it was a 3-day, all essays. And
so it's a pretty heavy-duty bar exam.
A heavy-duty bar. You handwrite it for 3 days, and it was the first time I'd ever been away from the kids. And I can't remember whether Tom stayed home or got a babysitter. And in those days, since the Montana graduates were automatically admitted, it was only people who had studied at Harvard or Yale.
That's right.
Or exchange. There
was some LaSalle in there mixed with the Harvard, Yale, and LaSalle, right?
So there were only 8 of us that took the bar exam that year. And you found out the next day.
Well, that's why they could afford to have it all be essay, because there wasn't 150 kids doing it. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So how'd you do? Did you pass?
I did, and got a call the next day from Dick Conboy, who was clerk of the Supreme Court, and said I'd passed, and that I had to be in the House chambers or the Supreme Court chambers at noon or sometime that day. And so I did, and I was sworn in. And
you were suddenly an attorney.
And my big, I was expecting our 5th child. So I was like 5 months pregnant or something, and I wore a red maternity dress. And the Supreme Court had just been remodeled, and it was all purple and gold and everything. And I stood there and thought, I really clash.
I'm clashing.
I'm clashing here. Yeah.
So now you're an attorney, and once you settled in, you decided maybe you could use those skills. Your first effort at that was helping the Legislative Council draft bills in the 60.
Yeah, the Legislative Council had just been recently started.
It would probably have been the 67 session. Yeah.
Probably so, because before the Legislative Council, lobbyists drafted bills for legislators.
We've often told the story, which happened when the Legislative Council tried to figure out when they drafted the bills. There were so many original copies, and one would go to the House and one would go to the Senate and everything else, and they couldn't figure out where the last one was going. Gene Tidball, who you knew, was doing research. We've got to figure out where this last bill goes to. And it turned out it went to the Anaconda Company because they wrote most of the bills.
Right.
And so, but in that session, you became a bill drafter. It was a new function of the Legislative Council, which was a new council.
Right.
And you did that. And
the Legislative Council is the research and bill drafting arm of the legislature.
Right.
And of course now they have year-round staff that do studies and print the codes and all that.
Yeah, it was a brand new thing back then, and I
had no idea what a bill was, except the kind I got in the mail.
Yeah. So you did that, and you ended up 2 years later in the 69 session, you ended up drafting bills or reviewing bills for Forrest Anderson.
Governor Anderson.
You were asked to go to work in Governor Anderson's office.
Right.
To review bills. Tell us about that.
It was mainly just to review the bills, but not for policy or anything. If there were any big grammatical errors, I would call them to the governor's attention. But mainly I would just meet with the governor, and I think with Duke Crowley there too, because Duke was his chief counsel. And I would just say, it would be a stack of bills that had been passed and were waiting for his signature. And I would just say, this bill does such and such. Most of them he already knew about, et cetera. But this is the bill that does such and such. fine. He would sign it.
But
This is the
you
bill.
could sometimes say, but I found a couple of mistakes in this bill, and we,
Yeah, right.
And they didn't
at
have
that time, they didn't have a
mandatory.
veto.
You either
Right.
vetoed them outright, or you signed them.
Right,
Now we got a lot more flexibility under the new Constitution.
right. Is that
There
still
we go. Yeah, I want to get that. Make sure that mic is out there.
Okay.
So you worked for him in Forrest in 1969 during the session. That ended, and he had a special project that he wanted you to be part of. That's where we met.
That's where we met.
In
Executive reorganization.
August of 1969 at Executive Reorganization, right?
Executive reorganization. Yep. How many were there? Like 160 offices?
Well, we ended up saying 188 boards, bureaus, and commissions.
188.
And we needed
Okay.
to trim it down to 20.
20's plenty.
Yeah, 20's plenty. And so you were hand-selected to be part of that staff. I wandered in the door. I think we were among the first 2 or 3 in the door. That's when we first became acquainted. And so we were involved in helping the executive branch get modernized under the old Constitution, most of which transferred into the new Constitution. Most of the things that were done there were retained. So that's where we met, and you were doing that. And so that brought us at the end of the 1971, the legislature was taking up reorganization, the bill to actually do it, because
Right.
the Constitution has now been amended to say you have to have 20 departments maximum. So while that was going on, you again were helping in the governor's office again. That's my recollection. And then, but afterwards, after that session was done, the 71 session was done, and a few months went by, suddenly we had a constitution being enacted. We had people being elected, running for the Constitutional Convention. Did anyone ever approach you and say you ought to run for the Constitutional Convention?
No.
No, they didn't. But in any case,
But I was working for Legislative Council.
so you slid over to the council. Okay.
I was on the legal staff of Legislative Council, if I'm remembering correctly, because I remember the executive reorganization.
Oh yeah.
That ended up, I think we had 66 bills or something like that.
Didn't you slide back into the implementation phase of reorganization after the session? And then from that, Forrest loaned you to the CONCON?
CONCON.
So he said, it's okay if you guys take Diana for a while. And do you remember when they first told you what you were going to do? And let's talk about what you were going to do. They were Style and Drafting Committee.
Style and Sandra Muckelson and I were the only attorneys. Right. And that's the committee that reviews all the bills as they come out of the committee and passed by the committee of the whole. And as they come out of the committee, they go to Style and Drafting.
You had the committee, and they presented it to the floor. But when it came to you guys, you had to draft it so that it had one voice. Was that the idea?
So for the Constitutional Convention, I was research coordinator. And in that, it was like being head of bill drafting. When a delegate had a proposal, it would come through my office, and we would draft the proposal.
You'd shape the proposal.
Right.
And that would go on
just
with
like
all.
A bill.
And those went into the substantive committee. For example, of the Bill of Rights Committee, if somebody wanted something in the Bill of Rights Committee to consider, they would take it to you guys. You guys would shape it, and it would often go to the committee.
Right.
And they would act on it one way or another.
Right.
Ultimately, what they acted on came to the floor and was debated. And let's take the Bill of Rights as an example. Substantially everything in the Bill of Rights Committee had recommended ended up being accepted by the floor. The Committee of the Whole, which is all 100 delegates. Then they shipped it back to your group again. Is that right?
Right. Just for style and drafting, grammatical, and we were told at the very beginning that one of our duties in style and drafting was to make the Constitution read as though it was written by one person, and that you don't call something a unit and then call it something else. We never changed. We didn't care about policy. But I remember reading bills not even knowing exactly what it was all about. We didn't care, but I cared that if it was a crazy idea, I just cared that it was worded correctly.
Okay, so you wanted, and I think that Gardner Cromwell, a professor of law from the University of Montana Law School, was a hired consultant to the committee and worked with you guys. Is that right?
Exactly.
And so you ended up, and he is the one that I think said we've got to have one voice. When you can't have it.
I think it might have been chairman of the committee, John Schiltz. He was a lawyer.
Yeah. I think I read somewhere where he credited Gardner with saying,
"Could be.
Hey, we need to draft this thing so it sounds like one person wrote it, so you don't have it be disjunctive. One article sounded one way and the other article sounded another."
Exactly.
Because heavens to knows Thomas Jefferson didn't talk the same way Benjamin Franklin did.
Or Bob Campbell.
Or Bob Campbell. Yeah. So you were putting it in the singular voice. That's what you guys were doing once it came back to you. And
correcting any errors, and we had a style manual that we followed to make sure use shall when you're supposed to say shall, and may when you're supposed to say may, or whatever. Yeah.
I was going to ask. I should ask you ahead of time. Did you bring along the thing that went to the voters?
Oh, the newspaper.
Yeah.
I did.
Okay, good. Let's bring that out, but we won't get to that quite yet, but let's get it out here because that was an important function of that committee, and you were the center of that very important piece of work.
I wrote it.
There you go. There you go.
And went to Billings and oversaw the printing of it, and it was mailed to every voter.
You look at that thing, it's pretty amazing. We'll talk about that because as soon as you guys had done all of the committee reports, and then you smoothed them all out and made them one voice, they were all were acted upon. They didn't all get 100% of the votes. And then you had a document, a singular document that had to be presented to the whole convention again. It's all written up. And in that document, they had to decide whether they would sign it or not. They didn't actually cast a vote. They cast a vote by signing it.
Oh, I forgot that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I went into the journals to find a vote that said, I hereby vote for the Constitution, complete and total. And there is no such vote.
They just all went up.
They simply called the roll and said, if you want to come forth and sign this Constitution, you may do it. And that day, the 54th day of the convention, the 24th day of March, 1972, every one of 100 came forward and signed the Constitution.
You are exactly right. And I think I'm remembering that there were a handful of delegates that voted against it, but they signed it.
Yeah, well, they opposed it in the ratification vote.
Right.
That when it came up to a vote of the people, there were 8 or 9 or 10 of them that were kind of in opposition. But they signed it because they produced it.
Right.
And so at that point, that was the end of March. It had to be presented to the voters. in June, and the decision was to do it in June 6th. And you went quickly to work to produce this document here.
The sample ballot.
Oh, it had so much in it. It's amazing.
Right. Well, it had the Constitution, and every section of it I compared with the 1889, and then wrote what was new, what it did.
And this was
an explanation of each section.
This was written by you. Well, the Constitution is in it, but also what's in it is we'll see what we have here. We have an explanation of the convention. You drafted all the history of Montana's 3 previous efforts at a constitution. You had a sample ballot in here, so people could see what the ballot was going to look like. The main issue and 3 other issues, side issues, right?
Right.
Gambling, death penalty, and the unicameral legislature.
Right.
And then you had the history and highlights leading up to the whole creation of this Constitution. So this is a wonderful document to find and to read even today. And then the highlights of the Constitution, article by article. I don't know if you knew, you remember you wrote that, and it said here, Article 1, here's the highlights of it. Article 2, here's the highlights of it. What was retained from the 89 Constitution and what was new. And you articulated that. And then the full text of the Constitution. And that's the remarkable thing, was you explained, I'm going to hold this up, you had the written thing, and you explained the in the blueprint exactly what each section meant, what the changes were, the way it was to work, and everything else. So anybody who wanted to read about the Constitution, and they got tired, as Gardner Cromwell would say, he'd tell them, go read that blueprint of Diana Dowling's. And so the full text was in it, the color-coded comments, the schedule of transition and adoption. You even listed all the deletions, the officers, and all the 100 delegates. So that is a comprehensive thing that every voter in Montana was able to get their hands on.
I thought I just had. Do you think it was yellow to begin with? I don't think so. I think it was more like white.
Yeah. And let me just say that there was a letter was written to you by Gardner Cromwell, who was the professor at the law school, who had worked with you throughout the convention.
He was the consultant to the Style and Drafting Committee.
Right.
Yes.
And he indicated that at the Con, and he was pretty serious about himself. He's a hell of a good law professor, but he said that at the Con he worked with, his word was, he'd been pleased to be able to work with a competent group. So everyone was competent there he was working with. And he referred to the voter guide as your brochure. He knows you did all the work on it. And he said it was very good. So you still passing muster at that point.
Great.
And he made this statement that you, Diana, accomplished very well the job of providing the to-the-point explanations. And he indicated that when people would approach him and he'd say, well, you got to read that thing, and they said, oh, God, we've tried to. It's so darn long. He said, just read the blue lines. Which was great. The blue lines are great. That's what you wrote, your explanatory language. And then he ended up saying, so kudos to you, young lady, for a tough job well done under pressure. So that...
I love that letter. That was very dear to me.
I mean, it speaks well to your record of accomplishment always.
Thank you.
By the way, I when you were first past the bar, I seem to remember a newspaper article that kind of said this: you were kind of the first of your kind to enter the bar as a woman, through correspondence.
That's what it said. The first woman to
Right.
pass the bar exam, to take the bar exam and pass.
You are a trailblazer. Which they happen to be from Portland, not Seattle.
Well, I don't know about trailblazing. You're the one with cowboy boots on.
Well, yes, we want to watch what we step into here.
Okay.
In any case, this thing, after that finished, you had another important responsibility, which came about later, because you left the Constitutional Convention and you went through a lot of different things in state government, but relative to the Constitution, you bore the responsibility of these things being produced.
Well, that's when I went to work for the Legislative Council.
You became first you went to work for the council, then you became the director.
Head of Legal Services,
Right.
and then the director when Rose Weber resigned. And she was a wonderful, long-time Legislative Council director. And I took her place,
And you
which is hard to fill her shoes.
took on this responsibility. And to reminding folks, when they see these books here, these books are the transcription of every word
Verbatim.
said, a verbatim transcript, and along with a number of records of everything that happened in the creation of the Montana Constitution. So and you can actually, I don't know how many copies of this thing you printed.
1,000.
1,000. And that was a one-time only printing. But luckily, they're now online.
Oh, wow.
I went and looked at them last night, because mine is sitting right here. And so I went last night looking online and was able to find all the volumes. And you can go right through and you can read it all. And this is verbatim what every delegate said at any time, the entire record of the creation of a Constitution.
Now that was quite a job,
Tell us.
because that took, I don't know, it didn't start till I think it was like 1978.
Right.
We decided we would publish the transcript of every word everyone said, and we had tapes, a recorder tape that Marie Durkee had made, because she was the recording secretary. And two of our staff started listening to those tapes, but there was a problem with the recorder. She was a 4, and they were trying to use 2 tapes to listen. Big time problems, and it was delayed because we had to buy new recorders. They kept breaking down, and then they really couldn't. They finally found out that the tapes they were trying to listen to were not the original tapes. They were copies or something like that. And it was in 1978 they found the original tapes in a box of memorabilia in Leo Graybill's garage.
Leo was the president of the convention.
He was president of the convention.
He boxed stuff up, which sounds like something familiar today.
Right.
An executive.
And put it in his garage.
And it ended up in his garage,
And when
unlocked probably.
When they never opened them, when they were found, I don't remember how they found them. He donated them to the Historical Society on the spot.
Right.
And then we were able to use it to listen to, but there were other problems with they listened to it and listened to it again when it wasn't quite clear, and listened to it again. I don't know how many recorders we went through, breaking down.
You wore out the machines.
And they changed it. They compared it. The proofreaders compared that with Marie Durkee's notes or
Right.
whatever, and changed them. And anyway, I think it's a verbatim transcript. And there's like 9,000, there were 9,000 pages that they went through.
And
it ended up costing like $300,000 to print the 1,000 copies, which was way over what we thought.
There was a committee. You got an appropriation from the legislature.
Right.
And there was a committee to supervise it, and this was Margaret Warden's committee,
Right.
which was the Public Information Committee, or whatever that term was. It was the one that did that. And so they had a committee, and there were some legislators involved too.
Exactly.
So it was some con people. Margaret had become a state senator by that time. So while she was the head of the committee in the con, she was then subsequently a Montana senator. And so she became part of it. Several, Joellen Estenson, John Shantz, legislators, and also Arlene Reichert and Mark Etchart and Maynann Ellingson. So we had a pretty good bunch to supervise that, but you were getting it all done. And tell me about the
staff of the Legislative Council.
Yes.
Not me.
You must have been a good delegator.
We had, the Legislative Council has had fantastic staff. Same staff that drafts all the bills and publishes the codes, but our proofreaders were something else. I think, and then there was one that did the index.
Oh, the index one, the little one here is the index.
Yeah.
Doing that after it's all done.
Wow.
And you didn't have computers doing as much then as they would do now.
Not at all. We were just computerizing, just in the beginning of it. But copies were made by I think mimeographs is what we used. I bet
Mimeo, sure.
Yeah.
Can you think about that? Whether they were the hand-cranked Mimeo or not, I don't know. The first volume was published in 1979. It actually took 3 years to actually get them all published. But you'd been doing work ahead of that.
They were listening
yeah.
and proofing and comparing and redoing.
So the record of the Constitution, the creation of the Constitution, has been,
and it was proofed against, like all the votes on bills. There was an official record kept of the bills, and the transcript were compared with the official record of the votes to make sure that information was correct.
And then the votes are included in there and everything else. Now, these are the people who were on the Style and Drafting Committee. Do any of those names bring out a memory or two of delegates?
I know you told me before that you asked me about, did I remember certain con delegates, and most of I would have to say I didn't know any of these people except Jerry Lindorf,
right,
who worked for my husband. During the con, I probably didn't know them. But afterwards, and including Representative Schultz, who was the chairman of our committee, because I didn't interact with him a lot.
You just presented him the product and he looked at it?
In the committee, I would, say, here's what I've done up in the little room on the 4th floor of the Capitol that I got lost all the time. Couldn't even find the room. Okay. Representative or Delegate Burkhart was a minister, and I knew of his work through that. And Chet Blaylock I got to know really well when he became a legislator.
Senator, yeah.
And Richard Rader was a famous historian. J.C. Garlington, very very
respected,
esteemed
attorney.
lawyer. And I remember Robert Kelleher from his eyebrows. I always think, people are going to think my eyebrows are like...
famous for his eyebrows and backing of the unicameral.
Yeah.
He was the unicameral guy.
And then after the Con, I got to be good friends with Betty Babcock. And in fact, we went to Korea together on it was called Ambassadors. There were like 20 of us from Montana that went to Korea. And I got to be good friends with Betty, and from then on. And then Dorothy Eck, I had a lot of contact with her because she was still involved in.
She became a state senator too for about 20 years.
Right, and she was still really interested in the Constitution.
Well, yeah.
And
she came out of the League of Women Voters,
exactly.
which was so important in the creation of the Constitution.
Absolutely, and the passage thereof. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, let me slide back a little bit to this document. Tell us about when you finished writing that document. It had to be printed up, and you say you had to go down to Billings to get it printed. They had a big printer down there.
I would assume. Well, I don't remember exactly, but I would assume it went out to bid.
Yeah.
Sure. There were only a couple of printers in Montana that could handle stuff like that. And I don't remember the printing company or anything, but I took and I don't remember whether, I think they took the draft.
The camera-ready version of it, probably.
See, I don't know who did the camera-ready version. I think the printer might have had to do that all. I don't know.
Yeah. Now, did you just sit there and watch them do it, or what did you sit and want to?
Well, I remember sitting there and people coming out and ask me a question now and again. So I must have just delivered camera-ready copy and waited.
And you were just. Did you
don't remember.
Did you put them all in your trunk when you were done? It was a little bit too big for that.
Jeez, I don't even remember.
Tell me now, after having been involved in, now this is before this document, which was later, having been involved in the Constitution and been involved in reorganizing the executive, then into the Constitution, and on June 6th of that year, when it passed by 2,500 votes, roughly, do you remember your feelings at that time? Were you kind of excited about the fact that it had been, I know it was challenged, but still, did you?
To be honest, I don't think I paid much personal, emotional attention because I really wasn't that involved. But it meant some 100 and some bills in the legislature the next season of the legislature, just doing cleanup.
Implementation. You had to do that. Yeah.
And a lot.
So
of
you were already focused on the
implementation.
On the implementation.
Because there were, I think, I don't remember the number, but 100 or so bills just to clean up what the Constitution, they need housekeeping, we would call it, housekeeping, to make the law.
Well, and then there were also the substantive things that had to be done to implement it.
Because we call that housekeeping.
A lot of places in here it said, for example, the now famous, because of what happened in the last session, Judicial Nominations Commission. The Nominations Commission was discussed thoroughly in the when they wrote it up into it said, there shall be a nominating process as done by the legislature. So they gave the legislature the ability to do that. And they did it. And they created that commission, which sufficed for 50 years, but nonetheless, there were a lot of places where they empowered the legislature and didn't do the detail. Obviously, Constitution needs all kinds of statutory backup in detail.
Well, that's one of the wonderful things I think about our 72 Constitution, is the old one had a lot of legislation in it.
Right.
So it, and it was there for years and years and years. And this one does not. It leaves that to the legislature, so those kinds of things can be changed by the legislature. Mm-hmm. And not, this has lasted 50-some years. I don't know, how many times has it been amended?
Well, it's actually not a lot compared to most other states. Most other states regularly almost revamp their constitution, or they will do a whole bunch of wholesale changes, and then it's not hard to amend Montana's constitution.
Right.
They made it fairly easy because, among other things, the amendments did not have to start in the legislature. Under the old Constitution, they had to start in the legislature. If the legislature didn't like something, it would never even get on the ballot.
Right.
But they empowered the people.
Right.
This whole thing is about empowering people, and they empowered the people to do an initiative, to write up something and say, if we get enough signatures, we can present this to the voters. So we've been amended quite a few times, but it's compared to other states, we could be a lot more than we have been. So I think the document was written well in those broad terms of principles.
Absolutely. And it has to come up for vote every 20 years.
Every 20 years, they ask
whether or not to have a convention.
Whether or not to have a new convention, and in 1990 was the first time they had a vote, and then they had a vote in 2010. And then they have another vote scheduled in 2030. And to this point, the voters of Montana have basically kept their hands out of a total rewrite. And one reason being that they can amend by initiative. That if somebody has some, and someone was telling me the other day, if you got a problem with that Constitution, don't throw the Constitution out, solve your problem with an amendment. Because either way, it's got to go by the people. So in a way, that's, but the fact that you wrote it, and you and Sandra, and drafted all that stuff in the under the Committee of Style and Drafting, obviously it stood the test of time of being understandable and being more about principles and than about detail. So I guess you are to be congratulated on that in a sense.
Well, the staff.
Well, you can't do it. Now, the staff didn't do that. You did the writing.
Well, this. Well,
I mean, excuse me,
no.
Of the Constitution itself. You shaped the constitutional language. It came one, they voted on it, but you had to make...
I know, but the Constitutional Convention staff,
the research analysts?
Yes,
yeah.
And, we talked before about Dale Harris, the godfather of the Constitution, and he had been on so many commissions and committees before. He was a walking encyclopedia of constitutions. He knew what every constitution in the United States was like, I think, and of course his staff staffed these committees and commissions and study committees, and then they staffed the CONCON itself. That was a big help.
Most of them are part of this series, and we're talking to each one of them so we can get their experiences because they were there pre-drafting a lot of stuff for 2 years ahead of time because in those days we didn't have an internet, if you wanted to do research, you had to call up somebody in North Carolina and say, could you please send us by mail a copy of your Constitution? And then, oh, can you send us, are there any articles about your Constitution? And so getting materials for research was an arduous task. And those people really worked hard to get that done.
And it just makes me think, if the people that ran for Constitutional Convention had any idea of the stack of studies ready and waiting for them.
When they got there, it was ready. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
There we are, a stack.
Yes.
They would write books.
Oh, you're on the executive committee. Here you go.
Yeah, yeah. You better study real fast. There's a lot of information here. It was a pretty marvelous process and pretty marvelously managed in the sense to be done in 54 days.
And a lot of that was just the seating alphabetically and the prior work that had been done. Yeah. I was in a history class. I took a lot of classes from Dr. Swartout at Carroll College. And at one of the classes, he was telling the class of 100 students about our great Constitution and how other states really looked up to it and had modeled after it, and how marvelous it was that they did it in 54 days. And he said it was because they were seated alphabetically and didn't carry on the. And anyway, I wrote him a letter and said the 54 days was really due to staff because, they didn't have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, and they also were saving up a little money in order to use it to promote the Constitution, and then the court said you can't spend it. So the best laid plans didn't work out.
Yeah.
They had to scrape up a few bucks, and that's where Betty Babcock came in, because she gave an office to the effort in the Colonial, where they could center their operations, and she became an asset, a real advocate.
Right.
In fact, there's a wonderful story in one of our other episodes. Oh no, it was when we held the celebration. When we held the celebration in June of this year, and someone got up and described what had happened. Who had been there was a very close assistant of Betty's, and said that Tim, her husband, the former governor, and some of his old drinking and poker playing buddies were all together at their house, and were bashing the Constitution right after it. They didn't like it because, remember, the powers that be didn't like the Constitution because it gave power to the people and took it away from the big powerful interests that had had it for 83 years. So they didn't like it and they opposed it openly. Well, former Governor Tim and his friends were kind of their ilk. They really didn't like it, and they thought it ought to be terrible, And they were all over there at the Babcock house, and Betty was serving them coffee and tea and cookies and things like that just to make them comfortable. And she keeps walking around and she's hearing these guys bash it. And she apparently stopped and she says, all right, I've heard enough from you guys. I absolutely disagree with Tim on this thing, and I'm for that Constitution. In fact, I'm going to leave right now because I'm going to do everything I can to pass it. And she left, and they opened up an office at the Colonial to help them pass it. So that was described in one of our other episodes here. So it was a pretty interesting thing.
Yeah.
Well, we've kind of captured your constitutional stuff, but I think this is a human story about people who are involved and interested in participating. We're a small state with really long streets, as we say. Everybody kind of knows everybody, and we're still, even though we're now up over a little million people, and back then we only had 700,000 people, but we have a little over a million people. We're still a people state. Where people know each other. And so let's take a second and just kind of capture some other things you did career-wise before you hung it up. You did work for Ted Schwinden, didn't you, at one point?
Oh, you mean like with the lottery?
Like, I know you know.
That, you didn't tell me you were going to ask me. I remembered I was legislative council director, and one day, the people had just voted that they wanted a lottery.
Right.
And I hadn't paid any attention. I mean, I didn't even know how to spell lottery. And Terry Cohey was
right.
walking in the hall. She was the governor's
executive
assistant,
chief of staff, yeah.
She was walking down the hall, and they had just voted on the lottery. And I said, "Gee, I bet that'd be a fun job." And just talking because it had just passed. And I think it was the next day, Ted Schwinden called me to his office and said he wanted me to be the director of the lottery.
So you were the first director of the Montana Lottery. The first gambling that came about under the Constitution really was that lottery.
But it was a wonderful job, and most of my jobs, when I think about it, I liked learning because I didn't know how to draft a bill, I didn't know how to codify codes, and that lottery job was just. I went to a New States Lottery convention, or it was to learn how to start a lottery.
Well, that may have been your most unusual job, because it didn't. But obviously you brought credentials to it. I'm looking here that you worked for the Legislative Council for 20 years. You were the executive director of the Montana Bar Association. You were the first director of the lottery. You were a commissioner on the National Conference of the Commissioners of Uniform State Laws.
Like Uniform Probate Code,
right,
Uniform...
Right. So you were on that council, national level, for 12 years. You also, I'm trying to think, didn't you participate in revising the switch over from the revised codes of Montana to the MCA? You were the code commissioner for Montana. That means you had supervisory over all the laws of Montana and how they were written up and how they were codified into law books.
They were being, at that time, the Montana codes were being printed by Allen Smith Company in Illinois or Indiana.
Yeah.
So after a session, they would send everything to Allen Smith Company, and they would print it. They would codify them, which means giving them. When a law is passed, it appears in the laws of, let's say, 1971, Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3, just as they pass, and then they have to be put into a code. Yeah. And which means you give them numbers, and
so when you
the code was alphabetical.
You had an old code that was very archaic, and you participated as code commissioner in revising that into the what they call the MCA, the
3 million words.
3 million.
And we revised it, and now the legislature prints their own. This was the first code, Montana Code Annotated
Montana Code Annotated. Instead of revised codes of Montana, Montana Code Annotated. And so now whenever anybody looks at a law book, they're working out of a base that you built for Montana's legal system. Mm-hmm. I mean, you've had a remarkable run, and I'm so glad you're still here now, so we can talk about this. You've done so much. Well, in any case, time is wrapping up for us here, and I want to say that it's always such a pleasure to share time with you, my dear friend.
Thank you,
and
Evan.
You've made a big difference in the creation of this Constitution, which has made a big difference in the lives of everyone in Montana. So thank you for what you've done, And for all of our viewers, thank you for tuning in to Last Best Constitution. We look forward to seeing you with the next episode.